Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. Turns out I thought of some other things that it will be useful for us to talk about in relation to the way we handle disagreements as Christians. You surprised? Didn't think so. So today we're looking at Leviticus chapter 19 and verses 17 and 18 in particular, which contain one very famous short portion, but some other less well-known portions which are worth thinking about. Here's how it goes. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbour, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord. Well, that's fairly well known, isn't it? I am the Lord is a little phrase that punctuates the book of Leviticus, and in this chapter, which is lots of little expositions of parts of the Ten Commandments, it actually breaks up the little subsections. So that means that this section, verses 17 and 18, is a self-contained unit, because the previous verse 16, also ends with the same refrain, I am the Lord. So all of this belongs together. The climax of it is, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. Amen. We're all going to agree with that, aren't we? Who would want to not love our neighbour? None of us would want to not love our neighbour. But this couple of verses, highlights how we are to love our neighbour. The previous part of verse 18, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people. Wouldn't want to do that. That wouldn't be loving. But verse 17 also adds to this issue of how we love our neighbour. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. Well, we wouldn't want to do that, would we? So we don't hate our brother in our heart. We don't bear a grudge or take vengeance against our neighbour, but we love him. But there's one other thing in this short, self-contained section which shows us how to love our neighbours. And it's the second half of verse 17. You shall reason frankly with your neighbour, lest you incur sin because of him. This highlights the crucial question of who we should talk to if we have a disagreement with somebody. Imagine for a moment, I have a disagreement with John. Who do I go to talk to if I have a disagreement with John? Oh, that's easy. I go and talk to David, or I go and talk to Mark, or I go and talk to Brent, or I go and talk to the entire world on Twitter and Facebook. The very last person in the world I would go and speak to if I had a disagreement with John would be John. Which is the sin that this passage is talking about when it says, you shall reason frankly with your neighbour, the neighbour you have a disagreement with, lest you incur sin because of him. It's not his fault that I've sinned, of course, but it's because of how I've handled my disagreement with John that I'm now sinning by going and talking to Dave and Mark and Brent and the entire universe, when I should have gone and talked to him. In other words, this places a critical moral responsibility on every single one of us that when we have a disagreement with a person, the person we should talk to about it is the person we have the disagreement with. Now, of course, there are qualifications to this. This is talking about a situation in which the disagreement is within a community. It's your brother, your neighbour. And so it's very much talking about the situation that you might find when we have a disagreement, let's say, within a church or within a family. If you have a disagreement with somebody in the pew opposite to you. This is the kind of situation we're talking about here. It's not talking so much about the situation, let's suppose I disagree with some policy of Donald Trump's. Well, it's not my moral responsibility to go and talk to him first, because in respect of that issue, where he's the leader of an entire nation, I'm not really in the same community as him. Similarly, these books on the shelf behind me, I don't have quite the same moral obligation if I disagree with some aspect of N.T. Wright's theology, for example. I don't have the same moral obligation to go and talk to him personally about it. But to the extent that we are close to one another, we have a responsibility to engage with one another when we disagree. And it's so often the very last thing that we do. And so the possibility of achieving the kind of reconciliation that we talked about in the previous video with Euodia and Syntyche, who had a different opinion on something, coming to have the same opinion, the possibility of achieving that same kind of reconciliation completely evaporates. Because we won't talk to each other. We will talk. Oh yes, we will talk to everybody else. The world and his mother. But we won't pluck up the courage to ping out a quick email and say, hey listen, I love what you were, I overheard you saying the other day, but I wondered if I could ask you a question about something you said. To the person with whom we have the disagreement. A couple of other thoughts. If you're married, that close relationship ought to structure your interactions with other people. So I would say it's a very good thing perhaps to talk to your wife or to talk to your husband before going to talk to the person concerned. That wouldn't be to gossip in quite the same way. Similarly, if you're a child living in your parents' home, it'd be a very good thing to talk to your mum and dad about the issue that is on your mind before you go straight up to somebody else and talk about it. Again, we're respecting the other structures that God has put in place around us, within which we live as believers. But in general terms, the way to handle a disagreement between Christians involves talking to the person that we have a disagreement with. If we are not willing to do that, there is not the slightest possibility of our ever being reconciled when we have a different opinion. There is not the slightest possibility of us retaining the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Instead, what we will do is we will accumulate over time a stack of unresolved grievances and differences of opinion, which will be like a pile of dry kindling in the woodshed, ready to burst into flame the moment that lightning strikes. And that's what you will find. If we don't keep short accounts with one another, so to speak, one day what will happen is that some issue will flare up, which will set fire not just to that issue, but to 15 years' worth of previous issues that we haven't dealt with in the right way, because we've not talked to each other about them. So some more thoughts, this time from the mouth of the living God himself, speaking through Moses to all of us, as we think about this issue of how we disagree with one another. Look forward to seeing you all soon, I hope, God willing. But bye for now. See you next time.